Okay, welcome to another TCon video. Here today we're going to take a look at the concept of consumer and producer surplus, and we'll think about where to find those on graphs. Then we'll look at some challenging cases where consumer and producer surplus are a little bit more challenging to figure out where they are, and often that's because those situations involve some deadweight loss, which means the market's not functioning allocatively efficiently. And then we can examine how per unit taxes are another kind of tricky situation that makes locating consumer and producer surplus not so easy. But if you follow the rules for where you find those areas on a graph, then I think you'll be able to consistently get the right area. And we'll go in order about how to analyze each of these graphs that make identifying areas of surplus just a little bit tricky. So to start with, here we have a market that's functioning in equilibrium, and you can tell that it's allocatively efficient. So here we've got our demand curve, and that's just a reflection of buyer reservation prices. Hopefully you're familiar with the concept of reservation price from previously learning about it. So what that demand curve tells us is that here, maybe this is like the second unit or something, and here's how much somebody is willing to pay for that second unit. Well, that's how much marginal utility that buyer thinks they'll reap if they end up owning that second unit. So that willingness to pay is what the demand curve shows, and the supply curve shows the minimum acceptable price that a seller would be willing to take in order to part with that unit of a good. So that's a reflection of marginal cost. And we know that when marginal cost and marginal benefit equal one another, that's when we're allocatively efficient. And QE and PE here are the allocatively efficient price and quantity. Those are the equilibrium quantity and price where the market would function if it wasn't interfered with in some way. A couple of things to note about the fact that that is the allocatively efficient point in the market. The last unit, the QEth unit there, has a marginal cost that's equal to the marginal benefit or marginal utility that the buyer is going to reap if they buy that one. And another condition for allocative efficiency that you want to get familiar with is that there is no deadweight loss. In other words, the combined sum of consumer and producer surplus, or we could say the total economic surplus, is maximized in that situation. Now down here on the right in real small text is hopefully some knowledge that you've encountered before, but if not, let's highlight a couple of things about that. The green triangle represents consumer surplus. Well, what is that? That's the sum total of all the benefit that buyers get from interacting in a market. So one way of thinking about it is it's the total of all good deals that all buyers get for all the units they buy. We could also talk about consumer surplus reaped on a specific unit, and then we might think about the reservation price, the highest price a buyer was willing to pay for that unit, and then we'd subtract the price they actually did pay, and that vertical dimension there, probably 1 unit wide, if you're buying 1 unit of a product, times the height, that would be the consumer surplus reaped on that 1 unit. We can always find consumer surplus on a graph. Of course, here it seems like it's easy and obvious because it's the triangle on top, but in other situations it's going to be maybe a different shape, or we'll have to sort of judge where we might find it. But here's your 3 hard and fast rules. You can find consumer surplus beneath the demand curve and above the price that buyers pay and to the left of the quantity purchased. So I say price buyers pay and quantity purchased. There are some special situations where the price buyers pay doesn't equal the price sellers receive, or where the quantity purchased is different than the quantity sold. Here for the blue, that's the producer surplus. Well, that's the benefit that all sellers get from interacting in the market. And if we think about that, that could be on a per unit or a total basis just as well. But it's the price they receive minus the minimum price they'd be willing to take. So very much one thing that's kind of nice to think about is that very last unit there. It's the case that the seller and the buyer both really wouldn't reap any additional surplus from selling that one. Where can we find producer surplus all the time? Hard and fast rules. Above supply or marginal cost, if there's no supply curve, to the left of the number of units that sellers sell, and below the price that sellers receive. All right, so here's the first time it could get a little tricky of where to find price ceiling is the situation we're looking at, and where do we find areas of consumer and producer surplus when there's a price ceiling in effect. First, we go back up and think about, okay, what is a price ceiling? Well, it's a legal maximum price. In order to show any legal price restraint, that's like price equals a certain value. If you thought about it in algebra, if it was like y equals 6, you would probably put a horizontal line across wherever the value of 6 was on that y-axis. It's kind of similar here. This is a price ceiling. You can see this line going all the way across. That's reflective of the price ceiling, so P sub C there. And for it to be an effective price ceiling, in other words, for it to take effect or go into effect, it needs to be lower than the equilibrium price. If it were above the equilibrium price, then it would be an ineffective price ceiling because we would continue to trade this good for the equilibrium price. So let's say we said this is the legal maximum price. Well, first thing you need to think about is at that price, how many would sellers want to sell and how many would buyers want to buy? Well, the number buyers would want to buy comes from looking at that price and going all the way across to the demand curve right here. Whoops. And then you come down, you could label that QD. In fact, probably would be even better if this graph labeled that QD for quantity demanded. How much do sellers want to make and sell at that price? Well, the price is awfully low, so sellers don't want to make very many. And in fact, this right here would be quantity supplied. So the red bar indicates quantity demanded minus quantity supplied. That's how much more we'd like to buy at that price than sellers want to make at that price. However, how many units are bought and sold? How many units are traded? The quantity sold is actually right here, QS. And the reason why is because for a unit to be produced and sold and purchased, there needs to be a willing buyer and a willing seller. And in this case, the number of willing sellers is our limiting factor. So that's the number of units that got sold. Now we'll think about where will we find the areas of surplus. Well, let's do producer surplus first. The blue triangle E here is below the price sellers receive, above their reservation price or their supply curve, and to the left of the number of units they sell. Okay, that's how many units they sell, so that's also the number of units that buyers buy. Buyers only will get surplus up until this point. And so really none of that consumer surplus shape could extend past QS. So A and D are consumer surplus in this situation. And the reason they're dividing them up is because A used to be consumer surplus before the price ceiling was put in place. D was producer surplus that got transferred to buyers. In other words, lowering the price made it so that buyers who get one will get a bigger consumer surplus. Areas B and C are units that we should have made, units beyond QS but QE. We didn't make these and trade these. And the reason why was because the price ceiling was in effect. But we should have made and traded those. In other words, if we think about how much this unit would have benefited somebody, that's total height under the demand curve. But how much would it have cost to make this one? Only this much. So the distance between above the cursor there all the way up to the demand curve, that's part of this idea of deadweight loss. It's a lost benefit. We could have had mutual gain from buyers and sellers if we had made those units, but we didn't. And so over here, if you want to freeze it, you can get a little bit of a flavor for how you can understand that deadweight loss. And the key point there, probably the most essential point, is that because we produced too few, a quantity smaller than the allocatively efficient quantity, we ended up with some deadweight loss that was under demand, above supply, and to the right of the units that we actually purchased. So this is good that we could have achieved but didn't because we did too few deals. Now the opposite case would be a price floor, and that would be a legal minimum price. Best example of a price floor you probably think about would be like a minimum wage. So the idea is that we're going to say the price can't be lower than this. Well, for that to be an effective price floor, it would have to be above the equilibrium price. If you set a minimum wage way down here, people would still buy and sell their labor for this amount. At any rate, we can do the same analysis here and say at the price floor, which is horizontal line here, that's how many sellers want to sell. So if you were asked to label quantity supplied, that would go right here. If you were asked to label quantity demanded, you would come from the price floor over to demand and then drop down, and that's where they have the QD there. And QD in this case is also the quantity that's actually produced and traded, because that's the limiting factor is that buyers don't want to buy one beyond that quantity for the high price of PF. So area A was consumer surplus before, and still is. Area B used to be consumer surplus, but now because sellers get this nice high price, they reap area B and E as producer surplus. Um, Once again, C and F are deadweight loss, and you find them below demand, above supply, and between the quantity we made and the quantity that we really should have made, if you think in terms of like what would be the allocatively efficient output level. You can also break apart that deadweight loss. They've done so here with colors so that the browner triangle area C is deadweight loss that used to be consumer surplus, and the purple F is deadweight loss that used to be producer surplus. So those are price floor, price ceiling graphs. One of the other things that can be tricky in relationship to where producer and consumer surplus is if you have a situation where you're showing a per unit tax. So start off by thinking about the blue demand curve and the red supply curve. The market was in equilibrium operating at point E there, and so this is the quantity and this is the price here, QE and PE. Those were allocatively efficient levels, and before this whole triangle here, shapes A and B and the white space above it would all have been consumer surplus, and C and F and this white space below it would all have been producer surplus. So now we think about what happens if the government puts in place a tax, and they're going to tax however many dollars per unit. So this will be, remember, price is dollars per unit. So vertical distances are dollars per unit. Areas would be dollars because dollars per unit times units. But vertical distances are dollars per unit. So let's imagine that whole bracket height is the height of the tax. What do? Well, you draw a new supply curve exactly that amount taller. So that's going to be your supply with tax graph. Our book doesn't put those extra supply curves in, but I find it to be very confusing for most students to try to find points if you don't have an intersection point. So at any rate, here we go. We'll have supply tax. And the first thing we got to do is to say, where does the supply with tax intersect demand? So we'll find that point there. Okay. And go down from that point. That's the quantity that will be traded after the tax. And one thing that you could see initially is that the tax decreased the quantity, and that will be really the cause for why the tax is creating an area of deadweight loss. The next thing will be, what about price? Okay, we found the quantity, old quantity, new quantity, right? We could call that Q1 and Q2, although I like Q tax better. Well, what's the price after the tax? It's really a trick question. There's not just one price. PC is the price that consumers pay. And you notice that went up a little bit from PE. Didn't go up by the full amount of the tax, though, only about half the tax. The buyers are paying about half the tax here. The sellers receive that much, and then they have to give all the way down to here to the government, because that's the amount per unit that the tax is. So the price sellers receive is lower than the price buyers pay. And this creates the four labeled areas, but also these white triangles above and below. So after the tax is in effect, there are two prices, PC and PP on this graph. PP is the price producers receive, and PC is the price consumers pay. The difference between those is the amount the government takes from each unit having been bought and sold. The white triangle up here is consumer surplus after the tax, because notice consumers pay this price. So here's how many they buy. And then they get these little vertical spaces all added together for the triangle. Producer surplus after the tax is this triangle down here. B and F are decreases in total economic surplus that happened as a result of our quantity decreasing. So those are our deadweight loss, B and F. B is deadweight loss that used to be consumer surplus. F is deadweight loss that used to be producer surplus. Well, what about A and C? They label here fall in consumer surplus, fall in producer surplus. But A and C together represent the tax revenue that the government earned. So when you impose a tax, you end up with a pile of money. And this is how much tax per unit times the number of units that got bought and sold that you taxed. So it stands to reason that rectangle would be the pile of tax revenue. And A is really the tax revenue that came out of what previously had been consumer surplus, and C is the tax revenue that came out of what previously had been producer surplus. So we count that as part of total economic surplus because the government can do something hopefully beneficial for society with that raised tax revenue. And so that's a way that society can benefit, not just the buyers and the sellers, but other members of society could benefit because of the interactions of buyers and sellers in this market. One thing that's sort of interesting here, we're going to learn a little bit more, a lot more actually, about a concept called elasticity, but it has a bit to do with the slopes of the demand and supply curves. Up until now, you might not have really thought those slopes mattered much. We just kind of sketch in a line wherever we want. But they actually do. And one thing that they will affect is how a tax is distributed. How is the burden of a tax distributed between buyers and sellers? Well, here, oh, excuse me, sorry, there's another slide first, I guess, just illustrating that shape is deadweight loss. And then you can see over here, these two rectangles are tax revenue. This area up here is consumer surplus. This area here is producer surplus. This is what I was getting at here. So everything about these graphs is the same except for the slope of the demand curve. So we started at point E, and that measures up perfectly with point E over here. And then we did a tax of exactly the same amount. So we shifted, this supply curve has the same slope as the other one, and we shifted it up by the exact same amount. And what happened here? Well, in this case, where demand was pretty flat, and flat demand, as you'll learn in the coming days, is sort of a synonym for the idea of elastic demand. So when demand was flat or elastic, buyers were really responsive to a change in price. Buyers are very price sensitive. So as the price goes up, quantity decreases a lot. A lot of people are turned off by that. They buy something else instead. And so you'll notice here that the price consumers pay, this top dotted line, is only a little bit higher than the old price. Price producers receive is way lower. And the quantity decreased a lot because buyers were very sensitive to an increase in price. And you see that deadweight loss shape in tan there. So contrast this, what if demand were really steep? This is a situation where buyers don't care about price. They are not price sensitive. We would say that demand is inelastic because buyers are not responsive to a change in price. Well, if buyers don't care about price, guess what will happen? They will pay a much higher price. And here's old PE, and up here would be PC, price consumers pay after the tax. Here's price that producers receive after the tax. And you notice that only went down a little bit. Another thing interesting to think about, and they've labeled it on this graph that's taken out of your book, is that the deadweight loss shape is much, much smaller. Remember, triangle's area is 1/2 base height. Well, let's turn that on its side. Oh, no, let's just think about it this way. Here's the height. The height is the same height, but the base, that width of the triangle, much, much smaller when demand is steep and much bigger when demand is flat. So you sort of see how taxing a good with inelastic demand might give you a lot of revenue, might not decrease the behavior very much. If you want to change people's behavior, a good with elastic demand is one that will actually discourage the production of that good. We could play the same game, I suppose, with supply too. Here, everything's the same about it. Demand's the same. The equilibrium point to start with is the same. We imposed a tax of the same amount, but notice when supply was steep, shifting it up to that new, like the black line should be called S tax on all these graphs, that didn't decrease quantity very much. So here's base, here's height, small triangle. Over here, here's base, here's height, and it's a bigger triangle. That kind of helps you grasp a little bit of how a tax graph works. I think students have found that in the tax situation it can be tricky because price paid and price received are not the same, and that's where you really have to come back to those 3 rules of where you find consumer and producer surplus. Once again, just to be absolutely certain, because that's the central point of this video here, you find consumer surplus always beneath demand, above price paid, and to the left of the number of units purchased. So it would be the triangle to the left and above this point here. And where is producer surplus? Well, it's below price received. Notice price paid is up here, but price received is down here. So in this case, producer surplus is just that tiny little triangle above supply to the left of the quantity sold and below the price received. All right, thanks for watching TCon again, and please like and subscribe.